Wonderful. Thank you so very much, Kelly, for that wonderful introduction. I sometimes don't feel worthy of all those amazing words that you say, and so I'm really grateful to you. And thank you so very much for inviting me to do this talk. I am really excited about zines and zining. And so for folks who don't know what zines are, don't worry, I will get to that in just a second. By the end of this presentation, I imagine you'll know what zines are. But just give me a second to kind of introduce myself, kind of ground myself within this presentation, and then we'll get going. And so I also wanted to acknowledge the lands that I'm currently on. So I'm currently on the unoccupied, or sorry, on the occupied lands of the Comox First Nations. And the zine making workshop, as Kelly mentioned, was conducted on the territories of Lekwungen, speaking people of various nations on the southern tip of Vancouver Island. And I'm not that much further up at the moment, just a few hours north from Victoria. But I just wanted to quickly introduce myself and kind of talk a little bit about what brought me into this work and why I'm a zinester and why I'm so passionate about zines. And so as Kelly mentioned, I'm a Master's of Arts student. I'm currently working with harm reduction workers who are providing drug checking on Vancouver Island. But more so than that, I'm a punk, I'm an anarchist, I'm a raver, and it's really within those communities that I discovered zines. And so I discovered zines at the Anarchist Book Fair in Edmonton, probably 2003, maybe 2002, right around the cusp of the anti-globalization movement. And it was really within kind of the anarchist, activist, and punk rock communities that I've developed this love for zines. There are so many different kinds of zines. And once again, I know you might not know what that is yet, but I will tell you what it is in just a second. For now, I could just say that zines are kind of self-published magazines that are quite common within alternative communities. And over the years, I've really loved engaging in zine making. And so I see zines as a form of art. I see zines as a form of gift giving. I love making zines for people. I like making zines with people. And I think that there's so much potential in the act of zine making. And so I'm hoping to really bring that into this presentation. Unfortunately, Lexy isn't able to join us, as Kelly mentioned, but I just want to say that, Lexy is an incredible co-conspirator and accomplice and has been so instrumental in developing this kind of framework around zine making as an arts-based research method, and also in supporting the zine making that we all did collectively. And so hopefully we can all think about Lexy during this presentation. And if you ever get to meet her, yeah, just say thank you, and I'm sure you'll really appreciate her as much as I do. And so the purpose of this presentation is to give you a little bit of a context of the current crises that harm reduction workers are working in. And so, as Kelly mentioned, the overdose or toxic drug crisis, but also just inequities in death, like the death and violence have been part of the community, of the inner city community for decades. And so it's not just the overdose crisis, but it's really kind of a history of street deaths and a history of state violence that has resulted in multiple crises within the community. And that has also resulted in harm reduction workers and social service and inner city workers having to address those inequities and inevitably experiencing a lot of trauma and a lot of violence and a lot of grief. And then I want to talk a little bit about zine making within participatory action research. So some of the main themes that we kind of discovered as we did this directed study with Kelly, exploring zines as an art-based research method. And lastly, and kind of the crux of this presentation is to go through the zine making workshop that we did with the action team and to really show some of the zine pages and discuss them. And so I'm hoping that we can keep this fairly casual. So if you have any questions or if you want to interrupt, please do. The presentation will be probably about half an hour, 25 minutes. And then afterwards, we can open it up to questions and a discussion. And then I'll finish off with just talking a little bit about future directions. So me and Lexy kind of were talking about how we want to engage with zines in the future. I know that there's some folks here on the call. I'll just do a call out to Ali. Thank you so much for joining, who's also doing zines as part of their master's research. And so hopefully we'll be able to talk a little bit about that at the end. And so just to provide a little bit of context, Kelly also mentioned that the coroner's report came out yesterday, and it's quite tragic, right? We've been in this public health emergency for over 7 years, and it doesn't seem to be abating. We continue to see extreme rates of overdose deaths in the province, and across what is known as Canada. And so in 2023, as you know, the number was significantly higher than all previous numbers. And so we're continuing to see kind of mass death occur within the communities of people who use drugs within the street community. And because of that, we're also seeing an increased burden for people who are responding to the crisis. So harm reduction workers, housing workers, overdose prevention workers. And so this is kind of like one of the contexts in which people who do harm reduction work or any city workers are working, but it's not the only crisis. And so if we look at inequities in death, we know that people who are structurally vulnerable, people in the inner city, are significantly more likely to experience harms, to experience illness, and to experience death. And so here's a quote from Dr. Dasani, which kind of highlights the kind of the propensity of different kinds of illnesses that we're seeing within the community. And so when inner city workers are responding to the crisis, that is the overdose crisis, it's not just that they're responding to, right? They're responding to significant amounts of illness and preventable deaths within the community. And that can take quite a toll on inner city workers. And so part of the zine making workshop that I'm going to be talking about later is kind of looking at how people who work in the inner city interact with these crises, interact with grief, and interact with the impacts of structural violence, and then also how they see themselves within the context of palliative care and within the context of providing care to people at end of life in these contexts of crises. And I just wanted to touch on the action team. So what kind of brought me into this work was Kelly and Ashley's action team. So I started off as an action team member. I think it was about 6 years ago, right? Now that we all came together. And the action team brought together inner city workers, people with lived and living experience, to come together to discuss what palliative care was, approaches to palliative care, and to really kind of discuss what they were seeing in the community as workers. And so it was really within this setting that I kind of became acquainted with palliative approaches to care and really saw the potential for incorporating art-based methods within research, but also within kind of the collective care that we were all participating in as action team members. And so to provide a little bit of context to the action team, it was really a space where we came together to grieve, but where we came together to support each other. And I think that was really one of the most beautiful parts about the action team, was how we all came in with, different identities and different experiences, but we all came together over the fact that we were experiencing all of this grief and that we were seeing all of this loss within the community, not just, as I mentioned, with the overdose crisis, but with so many different preventable illnesses and deaths that we were seeing in the community. And so it was at this action team that we kind of decided to do the very first zine making workshop. And that out of that zine making workshop came a zine called Palliative Care Is. And as you can see, the folks here on the action team are holding up their contributions. Are holding up their contributions to that zine. And it was such an incredible process that when me and Lexy got together as master students, we were like, hey, why don't we do another zine making workshop? It was so kind of effective in allowing people to express what they saw as palliative care and also express what they were experiencing within the community. And this was all part of a broader kind of research program that Kelly is conducting, Kelly and Ashley are conducting, and this is ongoing research that folks are doing. And so hopefully we're able to kind of use the zines in this ongoing process of research, exploring equity and palliative approaches to care. And so I just wanted to touch on zine making within participatory action research. So all of you have heard me say zines over and over and over again. And this is the part where I actually kind of tell you what zines are. There's not much to it. So zines are essentially self-published magazines. They originated in the 1930s as fanzines, as they're called, around science fiction writers. So people would be reading science fiction, they'd be really into the science fiction, and so they would send the author like a little booklet about their love for science fiction. And over the years, zines have kind of taken on different forms. They have taken on different topics, different angles. Increasingly, zines are now e-zines, so they're not even in print format, they're generally online. But zines really exploded in the 80s and 90s with the Riot Zine Girl movement. And so the Riot Girl movement was essentially like a punk rock feminist movement that was looking at the misogyny and kind of male-centric seed in punk. And so all of these zines were created by feminist activists across North America and parts of Europe, as well as parts of Asia. And that's really where zines became kind of popularized within political communities and within activist communities. Zines can take topics, anything from gardening to skill sharing to cooking, all the way to political theory. There's probably zines for everything, and they're generally understood as a gifting economy. So generally people don't sell zines, although it's certainly possible that some people do, but zines are generally gifted to others. They're generally created collectively, and they really kind of offer this opportunity, as Jennifer Begelman says, to seize the means of production and to really provide knowledge through this kind of distributed network of gifting zines. And so when we were conducting a directed study, when we were kind of looking at existing literature within participatory action research that was using zine making, we really identified three central themes. And so zines as archives, zines as pre-political tools, and I'll explain that a little bit, and as well as zines as an embodied practice. And so zines as archives essentially document people and stories. And so over the course of the last century, people have been creating zines as a way to kind of document their communities, as a way to show different forms of politics, different forms of being. And I just wanted to kind of highlight how this might operate in terms of the zines that we made. And I just wanted to kind of share, my love for Paige Phillips, who was an action team member and a really close friend of mine, and an incredible harm reduction activist within the community, who supported countless of people in all of their daily struggles. When I think about this particular zine page, I remember Paige, right? And it's this way of memorializing a particular point in time and memorializing a particular process. And so the Riot Girl movement is a classic example of how zines have archived a whole entire political movement, a whole entire political community. And so understandably, zines are quite popular within archival studies, within museum studies, and library studies. Obviously, libraries house hundreds of thousands of zines. Our own library at UVic has a whole entire zine archive. And there's a lot of work going into kind of looking at zines as historical artifacts. As I mentioned, as historical artifacts for a point in time. But they also represent communities of thought. And so in some of the zines from the 80s and 90s and 2000s, you had all of these communities of anti-globalization activists, of anti-fascist activists, anti-racist activists, coming out with hundreds of thousands of different zines that are exploring theory and practice, and that are providing skills for activists who are engaged in direct action and other forms of political resistance. And so certainly zines have a really kind of strong foundation within political movements as a place of, as a way to discuss political theory and political praxis. And I want to say this for better or for worse. right? There are certainly extremely violent groups of people and fascist groups of people who also use zines. There's a whole entire world of Nazi zines, for example, and white supremacist zines. And so just because it's something that can be created by anybody doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be kind of created for good reasons or for reasons that, you know, some of us leftists or some of us more alternative activists might see as important. They can certainly be used for harm as well. But certainly they're very much embedded within politics and within alternative political movements. And so here's an example of a zine that I've always really appreciated, which is a health and safety tip at Militant Actions. It was kind of created during the anti-globalization movement to kind of teach people how to handle tear gas, how to engage with police, how to keep themselves and their communities safe during protests, essentially. And so that's kind of one example of how zines act as these pre-political tools. And so it's Stephen Duncombe who kind of coined the term pre-political in the context of zines. And essentially what he says is that zines themselves aren't political actions, but they can catalyze political actions. And so that's how you see it as a pre-political tool. And I think that's the same with lots of different literature. But certainly within zines, you see a lot of theory around anarchism, all sorts of kind of alternative political theories, which can inform political and systemic change. And so certainly politics and the political is a very important piece of zine making. And I think in the context of the zine making workshop that we conducted, we kind of see that come out in different ways. We see people talk about structural issues. We see people discuss ways to engage in policy and to engage in structural changes to support them and the people that they work with. And lastly, zines are identified as an embodied practice. And so what they potentiate subject making. So what I mean by subject making is the way that people see themselves as subjects of the world. And so, for example, with the workshop that we conducted, you know, workers might see themselves as just automatons kind of engaged in the nonprofit process, working their 9 to 5, making wages, selling their labor. But through the zine making process, they might be able to see themselves in a different way, in a different light. And so in the context of the zine making workshop that we did, what we saw is that people kind of saw themselves as workers, but saw themselves as political subjects, as activists, as health equity activists who want to change policy, who want to change the material conditions of the people that we work with. They created a new subject for themselves, if that makes sense. And so when I'm making a zine, I'm trying to identify who I am as a person, how I see myself in the world, and I want to be able to express that in the zines that I'm making. And so that's a really unique tool of art-based methods, is they actually provide a way of creating kind of an alternative subject to maybe some of the normative subjects that we see ourselves as. And it's also been identified as a form of slow scholarship. So I love the whole kind of slow scholarship movement. So as opposed to, you know, the publish or perish neoliberal university, zines are slow processes. They don't necessarily come together quickly. They take a while. People want to think about them. People take them home. They like add little collages and then they send them back. And I think through this process, it slows down the idea of research and it slows down the way that we engage in research because we're not just pumping out papers. We're not looking for impact scores. We're looking to actually create this collective tool that can possibly benefit the communities that we're working with, and that can really provide this knowledge translation tool within the context of academia that's more accessible than a paywalled journal, for example. And so I think that's a really unique aspects of zine making in academia, right? Like zine making in academia is fairly new-ish. It's not a very common tool. Certainly it's very popular in so many of like pop culture and different communities, but in academia, it's fairly new. And I think that there's a lot of potential for this slow type of scholarship to proliferate within, you know, the different work that we're doing. Zines are materialities. They disintegrate, right? Like a zine that's made out of paper, that's photocopied, has a life. Like eventually it will fall apart. And so these materialities I think are really interesting because it's this kind of physical object, but the meaning behind this physical object is immense, right? If I gift someone a zine, I'm not just gifting them a booklet. I'm gifting them an act of care. I'm gifting them my feelings. I'm gifting them my relationship with them. And so it's not just these like objects, but these objects have tons of different meaning. And in the context of the zines that we made, we share those zines with people. We pass them around to community. We gift them to each other. And sometimes we look at them to reflect and remember about the process. Right. When I'm feeling really sad about some of the folks from our action team who have since passed, I look at that zine and I remember this kind of cool process, little arts and crafts stuff we did with them. And I think that's really great. And because of that, it ends up being an alternative to positivist research. Right. And not to say that there's anything wrong with positivist research. It's a different way of conducting research. It's a different way of deriving meaning. It's a different way of creating knowledge. And so I think that's really exciting. And so we really brought in these concepts into the zine making workshop that we did, which I'm super happy to share with you folks. And so we really see zines as this way of kind of providing a space for conversations, which can help demystify death and dying and make topics more approachable. And this is essentially just a way of saying that through creative means, through these tactile means of creating, of collaging, of poetry, of all of these different methods, that we can discuss things that are challenging to discuss, let's say, in an interview context, in a focus group context. And I think that that's really one of the main benefits of conducting research through art, and specifically through zine making, is that it allows for a creative space where some of these topics that might be a little bit more challenging to discuss are a bit easier to discuss. Not to say that they're easy to discuss, but they're easier to discuss. And so I'd really like to share some of these pages from the zine making workshop that we conducted. This is the second zine workshop that we conducted. And I believe we had about 11 inner city workers and researchers participate in this workshop. And we essentially asked, what does palliative care mean to the folks that were at this workshop? And so here's a couple of examples of the pages that came out. I'm also going to be sharing some quotes from the transcripts that we have from the kind of chatting that we had during the zine making workshop, as I think it really kind of highlights the value of zines in research, but specifically the value of zines for our action team, for the little community of wonder beings that we have created, and how we support each other. And so if you look at these two zine pages, these are kind of your classic cut and paste zine pages, right? Where essentially folks are somewhat limited by the materials that they have to make the zines, but not necessarily, right? Because people have crayons, people have all sorts of other ways of engaging in art. But this is just a way to kind of show that words can be used to create something different, right? So the original words that were in a magazine, presumably, or wherever they were cut up from, had a different meaning from when they're kind of transcribed onto a zine page. And so if you look at this kind of zine on the left, we see these kind of important phrases, dialogue, voices of lived experience. It's time to prioritize people, justice, support, connecting, open conversation, love, compassion, right? These are all very important concepts in the work that we do with people in the inner city. And it's sometimes hard to be able to express those things when we're talking in a way that might not necessarily be as hard with collage. And so we see reduced stigma and increased inclusion. We're seeing these kind of political terms being put into the zine making page. And then on the other side, we have this kind of big why. And we have someone who put the question mark afterwards. And I think we're just asking questions around why we engage in the work that we do, why we're even talking about palliative care, why do we care about end of life? And I think that through the zine making, folks have kind of identified some of those things, breathing new power into life, that is such a powerful statement. And I think that that really shows how the inner city workers that we were engaging with, that we were doing this zine making workshop, kind of see themselves, right? See the way that their work leads to this new power in the lives of others. Pain relief, being good listeners, connecting. These are all very kind of important words in the context of the work that we're doing. And so here I wanted to share a couple of more zine pages, as well as a quote from one of the zine making participants. So the participant says, "Something that excites me about zines is that sometimes words can feel a bit limiting, but getting to try and convey them through creative means as well, and just like certain emotions and stuff." And so I think this really shows that art can create meaning in ways that logic or reason or words can't. And I think a number of philosophers, I specifically think of Jan Zwicky, who is an incredible philosopher at UVic, who wrote this kind of incredible seminal work called Lyric Philosophy, to kind of show that you can derive meaning from art in ways that you can't derive from logic. And I think that that's really important. And so here we see, for example, we see these words, but it's really the background of this zine page that I find so fascinating. So it starts off with a broken heart, and then there's another broken heart, and then the broken heart is being mended. You know, there's a bandage over the broken heart, and then there's a full heart. And I think that this kind of shows the underlying journey of healing that is possible when we come together as workers and engage in these processes, right? And so here we also have the words, "Loneliness is hazardous to your health." We're disruptors, grieving, struggles, taking action towards, courage. These are all very political like political words. And I think that it's so cool to see these words on top of this kind of story that you see with this heart being mended. And the particular, or the participant who did this particular page was talking about how the broken heart is such a symbol of the overdose crisis, right? It was a symbol that the purple broken heart was developed by someone in Montreal many years ago in response to harms around overdose. And so, you know, the participant was talking about how kind of it felt cheesy to use this broken heart, but then used it as a way to kind of show this story of healing, of mending, of coming back together. And then here's just another example on the right of how one of the other research participants kind of engaged with this idea of what palliative care means to them, also highlighting these very political terms: fight, change, resistance, reimagining, right? It's this way to kind of look at an alternative to the conditions that currently exist. And so I just wanted to give a few more examples. What I really like about the one here on the left of the screen is it's busy. There's so many words, there's so much collage, there's so much color. It's almost chaotic when you look at it, but there's certain things that pop out: compassion in action, reducing stigma. And I just love that because it kind of shows that there's this kind of beauty, or there's this message within all of this chaos that we're working in. And for folks who've done any inner city work, especially in recent contexts, like, it is very chaotic. It can be really intense. There can be a lot going on, but kind of within all of that chaos, we find these moments of caring, we find these moments of compassion. And to me, this is what that zine page kind of makes me feel. And then on the right, we have this like wonderful addition where someone took the words, pasted them, but then added context. They added their own words to the existing collage. And so, like, what the world needs now is love, sweet love. They added solidarity. So they're using the words that are available to them, right? So limited by the type of materials that we have, and they're supplementing it with their own artwork, with their own thoughts. I love that there's a key in here. We're talking about person-centered connection. I think this is such a great example of using different methods to articulate particular meanings, both through collage and artwork, but also through words and the way that people express them. And so here's another quote that I wanted to share. So it says, "Equity, support, resistance, resilience, courage, stories." And then I wrote, "Palliative care is radical love in the end of life choices, love in the face of all the unknown, love and comfort and justice for all. And once again, this was an addition, right? This wasn't just taken from a magazine and pasted. It was actually this context that was provided by the research participant. And I really like that. Like, I love that, the collage or the art provides this kind of foundation for exploring further feelings and emotions about a particular topic. In this case, palliative care and the work that we were doing. Once again, highlighting the political potential of zines, a path to equity, resistance and resilience, courage, stories. And on the other side, we see disruptors again, out of the underground. This is kind of tying in the history of zines into this kind of modern artistic way of engaging research. And I really like that. I think it's really cool. It's such a neat thing to witness people explore their creativity, especially folks who aren't used to it, right? Like, myself as like a longtime zinester, you give me like a magazine and I'll sit there and cut it out and like super comfortable with it, but not a lot of people are. And so it's really cool to see how people interacted with it, how they kind of let their guard down over the course of like a few minutes, how they kind of talked about it with their fellow participants. And I love it. I think it's so neat. And no stress, we're coming to the end of the presentation. I know I'm getting excited about this, but there's just a few more slides. And then I would love to hear about your thoughts about zine making and where you see the potential of it going. And feel free to ask all sorts of questions. And I'm talking lots now because my computer kind of froze and I'm not able to get to the next slide. There we go. So here we see another quote. It says, secondly, I want to say that coming here reminds me how to have hope, because I think in the day-to-day grind of this job, it's really easy when you witness the violence of the system. In an unending grind, it sort of destroys your soul. And so it's helpful to return to a place of hope. It helps you to continue, and it allows you to have some resilience in the face of the absolute enormous amount of bullshit that we face on a daily basis. The end. And this is I think this is such a cool example because it doesn't only show the kind of knowledge making potential of zine making, but it actually shows the healing potential of coming together around artwork. And so yeah, as inner city workers, we face all sorts of shit, and especially folks with lived and living experience who are not only working in the context but living the context. And so that can be draining and that can be so sad. And there's not a lot of opportunities for people to come together to discuss it. There's not a lot of opportunities for people to come together and process it. And so what's really cool about the action team and about the zine making workshops is that it's using research to facilitate a place for people to come together and heal, or maybe not heal is the right word, but to come together and discuss what it's like to witness violence, to experience violence. And I love this quote because I think it just really highlights the potential of solidarity amongst workers when there's space provided to explore some of these issues. And so I really want to credit Kelli, Ashley, and the team for providing that space for inner city workers and for actually using academia to do this really critical, important work within the community. And I'm just going to switch it to the next one if I can, but in the meantime, keep looking at this beautiful piece of art over here, and I will try and switch the slide over. Did I miss one? Nope. All right, so now we're just going to kind of talk about future directions. And so hopefully this will be more of a discussion. I just want to kind of highlight this particular quote. And so this is one of my favorite zines ever. It's written by Cindy Milstein, who is a Jewish anarchist in the United States, who often talks about rebellious mourning is kind of the stuff that that Cindy has developed through her writing and through their writing and through their work. And I think this quote really highlights for me the kind of the value of zines in the context that we're working. And so here it says, we mourn all that doesn't garner a marble monument or even a humble tombstone. We mourn all that we shouldn't have to bear losing and mourning if we were to inhabit a far more egalitarian, humane world. We mourn all that we love. And This for me is a quote that represents the process of zine making that we conducted with the action team. And so I brought this zine as an example at the very first zine making workshop to kind of show the different ways that people make zines, the different ways that people engage in zines. And for me, this is such a powerful quote because I think what we did during the zine making process is we mourned. We thought about the challenges of working in the inner city, and we mourned together. And oftentimes the people that we mourned don't get a monument, right? They don't get remembered by public health or by government. They're just another number, right? But for us, they were friends, they were family, they were people we engaged with over and over again. There were people who supported us, who cared for us. We supported them, we cared for them. And so I think that there's this potential that I'm really interested in exploring. How can people use art as a research method to derive new knowledge and to derive new meaning within the context, the challenging context that we're working in as inner city workers or harm reduction workers? And so lastly, I'm just gonna do a little self-plug for myself because in my own thesis, I'm also exploring kind of art-based research methods. And so, as Kelly mentioned, and as I mentioned earlier, I work with harm reduction workers who are conducting drug checking on Vancouver Island, and I really want to incorporate zine making into my thesis and in my ongoing research, because I think that there's a lot of value in making art and there's a lot of value in coming together and creating gifts for each other as a community. And so here are all the references for people who might be interested in learning more about zines and their use in academia. Thank you.